Well, it looks like the US military was pretty spot on about Niger, Africa. Sort of this prediction that the country was going to start to fall apart the more that partners pull out of Niger and the more that militant groups have access to the countries. Because unfortunately for Niger, they're sort of following in the same footsteps as their neighbors and allies, Mali and Burkina Faso. Now, Niger is not new to getting attacked by militant groups, especially on the border of Mali and Burkina Faso. But what is new is having hundreds of armed rebel groups riding on motorbikes freely and not afraid from attacks from above or attacks from in front of them, where they are willing to drive in the open and to attack the people of Niger and the soldiers of Niger. Now, according to the report, the attack took place 118 miles from the capital of Niamey. But still, this is just the beginning. 118 miles sounds far, but you don't need to be that far to cause a lot of chaos and instability and momentum for your militant group to start reaching the capital, or at least a major city in Niger. Who's to say these militant groups want to even attack the capital? Now, what's interesting is that the US military already saw this coming weeks ahead of any of this chaos, where we had no idea if the French military was going to eventually pull out of Niger, and we didn't know that the ambassador was going to hold himself into his embassy and cause even more chaos in the capital of Niger. So what the Pentagon did is that they took a preemptive movement to get out of the capital of Niger because, look, the US military is pretty much done in Niger. We can only do so much, and if more and more attacks are going to happen where you have hundreds of armed militants riding on motorcycles like they are the modern day cavalry, I think our mission is done in Niger. We can only do so much if we're not going to be allowed to fight these guys. The part that also worries me is that usually when African countries start to fall, these juntas want to prove to the people in the nation that they know what they're doing. The only issue is, in this specific attack, these militant groups were riding openly in the desert with these motorbikes, and Niger had enough time to release helicopters to go and try to bring in more reinforcements to fight these militant groups. But the thing is this, the U.S. military, use the U.S. military. We have drone assets to be provided for Niger, but Niger refuses to allow the U.S. military on an attack or an offensive. They only allow the U.S. military to be on the defensive. And since the U.S. military is placed smack dab in the middle of Niger, again, we are completely wasting our time. And I think we predicted this a while ago that we might as well leave Niamey so we're not going to get attacked or be in the middle of an attack. And look, Niger is not using U.S. assets. They're not using boots on the ground, let alone drone assets. Again, what are we doing in that country? Now, this chart or map, as you can see, all these like highlighted lines and the black and, all these shaded areas, these are where the attacks have happened in August. So last month of the time I'm making this video. And this was during the coup and really during the junta where everything was going down. But as you can see here, the black that's bleeding into Niger, this is another militant group. I can't say the names on here, but they're getting closer and closer to Niamey. And the other thing we have to understand is that the U.S. military, our hands are tied behind our back because we are at the mercy of the other countries that are causing all of this chaos. You have Mali, who cannot secure their country. You also have Burkina Faso, where we're about to get to them in a second, where they just did something so annoying. It goes to show where this country is about to lead into. And the other issue is that the country of Benin, right down here, Niger cut ties with Benin. So everything that happens in Benin, it's up to Benin to figure it out. But if Niger is not willing to work with Benin, you're going to cause more and more issues. And these militant groups are not dumb. They're not like hiding in a cave like we had this image of them in Afghanistan. They're watching the news, if not creating a lot of the chaos in the news cycle to at least try to sway either public opinion or to make people afraid of these militant groups. So again, I'm showing you this chart so that you are understanding that a lot of outside attacks are affecting what's happening in Niger because they're getting closer and closer to the capital of Niger. And if the capital falls, the country falls. Now, this is about the U.S. military and Niger, but we have to look at Burkina Faso if we're talking about Niger because they are a major ally to Niger. The thing about Burkina Faso, they are falling into the perfect trap for being a country who had a junta and now wants to tie in with the Russians. Understand this. These are all attacks that have been happening throughout Burkina Faso, and it's only increasing and increasing from 2022 to 2023. In fact, it's getting so bad that it almost looks like Burkina Faso wanted this to happen. Because now the leaders of Burkina Faso are saying, look, we took charge of this country to create a new political system, to create new leadership. But here's the issue. You have to allow us to secure the country in order for us to have new elections, because we want to have elections, but we can't have elections if the country is not stable. Now, again, it's almost interesting how Burkina Faso has been having a lot of meetings with Russia lately, possibly meeting with Wagner lately. And the whole thing is this. It's really fishy that all of a sudden Burkina Faso says, hey, you know what? No more elections. We're going to be in charge until the country is secure. And honestly, the evidence is leading towards these guys could care less if the country is secure or not, because as long as they're in charge, they're getting all the money, they're getting all the power and glory. And unfortunately for Burkina Faso, they are affecting what's happening in Niger, and in turn affecting what's happening to the U.S. military. Something else we really need to remember is that the biggest reason why we are really in Africa is to also counteract what Russia is doing and what China is doing, but more specifically Russia, because they really are boots on the ground. And this is the same exact thing that's been happening in Syria, where we're almost battling an opposition, even though we're fighting the same bad guys together. It makes zero sense. I've done a lot of videos on it to try explaining it, but nonetheless, understand that we have to stay in Africa. But as long as Wagner is still operating in Africa and they're creating more and more problems for the countries they operate in, that's actually a really good thing for Wagner. I don't like that they're doing it, but they need to do it, because the more instability there is in the region, the more of a job there is for Wagner. Because Mali, Africa, has kicked out the UN and the French, and they only are left with Wagner. Burkina Faso, they want to work with Wagner, and they definitely have very strong Russian ties with Putin. The leader of Burkina Faso already said they love Putin. Now, as far as Niger is concerned, they can't work with Russia as long as the United States is there. So I wouldn't be surprised if Niger says, hey, you have to leave to the U.S. military, because there already wasn't that much support for the U.S. military. They were always cordial and okay with the special forces and drone operators. Other than that, it seems like Niger wants to take a more aggressive stance like their partners Mali and Burkina Faso. But the thing is this, those countries are falling apart left and right as much as Niger is. Niger hasn't had an attack like this in a long time, where you had these militant groups on these motorcycles. So Wagner plays a massive role in how much the U.S. military could actually do. And the United States has predicted this would happen. They knew that the Russians were going to be in Africa to cause a lot of chaos, to cause a lot of problems. And it is causing a lot of problems because, again, we can only do so much. And if we're just wasting our time there and sitting around and not doing anything, what's the point? We need to move and continue operations somewhere else. Now, the Pentagon and other military leaders have sort of hinted that, we aren't in a hesitation to leave the country of Niger, but we are looking for other options. I know we like to pick on the French for leaving Niger, but it's actually becoming worse and worse. But I'm sort of torn, because I understand why the people of Niger want to get rid of their former colonial power. But the French were doing what they were supposed to be doing, at least helping out the U.S. military, or at least creating a military presence where there weren't a lot of militant attacks. When you look at all of Sahel Africa, all of the countries who are getting attacked left and right, Niger is actually the one country that's getting attacked the least. So now the chart is starting to go up. The statistics are starting to go up. It's looking worse and worse for the country of Niger. And of course, the U.S. military, what we do best, we're smack dab in the middle. But understand this. The Pentagon has already said we are looking for other countries to potentially operate out of, but 100% for sure, we are not leaving Africa. We cannot afford to leave Africa, and not only the U.S. military, but other European militaries as well. Now, another really big piece of data for the U.S. military staying in Niger and sort of predicting what would happen is that now that the French are leaving, you have more and more attacks, and the door is wide open for Niger to be attacked. Because yes, the U.S. military is there, but they're not doing all of the work. A lot of that burden was also put on the French, because the French were placed in Niamey, in the capital of Niger, so at least you had a garrison of really well-trained troops to defend the capital. But also, we have to say it as it is, wherever the French are, there seems to actually be less attacks in the region, because ever since they pulled out of Mali and there's less influence in that country, the attacks have tripled ever since the French have left. So now that the French have left Niger, that does open the door again for more and more attacks to happen. And the biggest reason why the junta overthrew the president of Niger is because they were saying, well, the president is just allowing the French to do whatever they want, and we're kicking out the French because they're not doing anything. There seems to be more attacks, but the junta are wrong. There were actually less attacks, relatively speaking, throughout all of the dangerous regions of the Sahel. Very little news out of that country. You sort of have to dig and dig to find what the U.S. military is doing, but what we are doing is essentially what the Pentagon has said we are doing. We are just sitting and waiting. Do we leave or do we stay? Do we leave or do we stay? The more and more attacks that happen, the less we can do. And the pressure gets put on the U.S. military because the same thing happened to the French, where Niger says, hey, all of these attacks are happening. Why are you not helping us? And Russia knows that, and militant groups know that. So if they can up the ante and they can up the attacks, it's going to make the U.S. military look terrible. And if we can make the U.S. military look terrible, hey, look, maybe the junta will kick them out. Now we have free access to the entirety of northern Niger. Niger might be the only country in Africa where militant groups can come the closest to literally taking over the whole country, because like 80% of the country is desert and very hard to maintain as it is. That's why the U.S. military is smack dab in the middle to make sure this doesn't happen, where we can at least extend our reach with drone operations and boots on the ground. The capital of Niamey is pretty much almost on the border where all of these attacks are happening as well. The U.S. military is not there, but nonetheless, as long as the U.S. military is in Niger, the country will not fall. But I don't know how much longer we're going to be there. Everything we said that was going to happen is happening. It happened in Mali, it happened in Burkina Faso, and it's happening throughout every single African country who's had a junta, who's kicked out Western powers, who's worked with Russia. The next country that this will probably happen to is Niger if they kick out the U.S. military, or if we decide to leave on our own.